Sometimes the most powerful moments happen when we least expect them. When Marcus Williams walked into that busy restaurant on a rainy Tuesday evening, he had no idea that one simple dinner would expose a web of workplace injustice that had been hidden in plain sight for years. He certainly didn't expect that a young waitress named Sarah would unknowingly confide in him about the daily struggles that were slowly crushing her spirit and dreams. What started as an ordinary meal between a successful businessman and a hard-working server would soon become a story that would shake an entire company to its core. Because Marcus wasn't just any customer that night. He was the CEO of the very restaurant chain where Sarah worked, and what she was about to tell him would change both of their lives forever. This is the true story of how one honest conversation over dinner led to the exposure of systematic wage theft affecting hundreds of workers, and how sometimes the most unlikely encounters can become the catalyst for justice. It's a story about courage, determination, and the extraordinary things that happen when someone with power chooses to listen to someone without it. Get ready for a journey that proves that real change often begins with just one person brave enough to speak the truth, and another person willing to hear it. The rain hammered against the windows of Henderson's family restaurant as Marcus Williams pulled his black sedan into the parking lot. At 42 years old, Marcus had built an empire from nothing, growing Henderson's from a single struggling diner into a chain of over 200 restaurants across the country. Tonight, however, he wasn't here as the CEO. He was here as just another customer, wearing jeans and a simple button-down shirt instead of his usual tailored suits. Marcus had made it a habit to visit his restaurants unannounced, but always in disguise. His employees knew him from company meetings and corporate videos, but they'd never seen him dressed down like an ordinary person. These visits gave him insights that no boardroom meeting ever could. He wanted to see how his restaurants really operated when the boss wasn't watching. The hostess, a teenager with bright pink highlights in her hair, greeted him with a tired smile. "Just one tonight?" "Yes, please," Marcus replied, following her to a booth in the corner. The restaurant was busier than he'd expected for a Tuesday night. Families occupied most of the tables, and the staff moved with practiced efficiency between the dining room and kitchen. Everything looked exactly as it should from his corporate perspective, but Marcus had learned that appearances could be deceiving. His waitress approached the table with a notepad in hand and a genuine smile that immediately caught his attention. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with curly brown hair pulled back in a neat ponytail and kind eyes that seemed to sparkle despite the obvious exhaustion written across her face. "Good evening. I'm Sarah, and I'll be taking care of you tonight," she said, her voice warm and professional. "Can I start you off with something to drink? Just coffee, black, and could I get a few more minutes to look at the menu?" Marcus asked, studying her face. There was something about Sarah's demeanor that struck him as different from many of the servers he'd observed in his restaurants. She seemed genuinely happy to be there, despite the clear signs that she'd been working hard all day. "Of course, I'll get that coffee right out for you," Sarah replied, hurrying toward the kitchen. Marcus watched her interact with the other customers as she moved through the restaurant. She had a natural way of making people feel welcome, remembering details about their orders and checking on them without being intrusive. It was exactly the kind of customer service that Marcus hoped all his employees would provide, but rarely saw executed so perfectly. When Sarah returned with his coffee, Marcus decided to engage her in conversation. "Busy night," he observed, gesturing toward the crowded dining room. Sarah laughed softly, setting down the steaming mug. "You're telling me. It's been like this since about 5 o'clock. Not that I'm complaining, though. Busy nights usually mean better tips." She paused, then added with a slight frown, "Well, when we actually get to keep all of them." The comment caught Marcus's attention immediately, but he kept his expression neutral. "What do you mean?" Sarah glanced around quickly, then leaned in slightly. "Oh, I probably shouldn't be talking about work stuff with customers. It's just been a long day." She straightened up and pulled out her notepad. "Have you decided what you'd like to eat?" Marcus ordered a burger and fries, but his mind was focused entirely on Sarah's cryptic comment about tips. As she walked away, he found himself studying the restaurant with fresh eyes, looking for signs of whatever issues she'd hinted at. Over the next hour, Marcus observed the staff more carefully than he ever had before. The servers moved efficiently, but he noticed subtle signs of stress that he'd previously overlooked. Hushed conversations between employees that stopped abruptly when managers approached. Tired expressions that didn't match the cheerful voices they used with customers. Small details that suggested something was wrong beneath the surface. When Sarah brought his meal, Marcus decided to probe a little deeper. "This looks great," he said, then added casually, "You seem like you really enjoy working here." Sarah's smile faltered for just a moment. "It's a good job," she said carefully. "The customers are nice, and my coworkers are like family. It's just—" She trailed off, looking uncertain. "Just what?" Marcus encouraged gently. Sarah bit her lip, clearly debating whether to continue. Finally, she seemed to make a decision. "Can I ask you something? Do you work in food service?" Marcus shook his head. "No, why? You just seem like someone who might understand. Most customers don't really pay attention to what goes on behind the scenes." Sarah glanced around again, then sat down across from him for a moment. "Look, I love this job, I really do. But there are some things happening here that just don't seem right, and I don't know what to do about it." Marcus felt his pulse quicken, but he kept his voice calm and encouraging. "What kind of things?" Sarah took a deep breath. "Well, for starters, they've been taking money out of our paychecks for things that aren't our fault. Last week, a customer complained that their steak was overcooked. I offered to have the kitchen remake it, but they decided they didn't want anything else. My manager told me I had to pay for the meal out of my tips because the customer wasn't satisfied." Marcus felt anger beginning to build in his chest, but he forced himself to remain composed. "That doesn't sound legal. That's what I thought too. But when I questioned it, they told me it was company policy." Sarah's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "It's not just me, either. They're doing it to all the servers. If a table walks out without paying, we have to cover the bill. If we accidentally break a plate or spill something, they dock our pay for replacement costs. Last month, I had to pay $60 because a customer said I was rude to them, even though I know I wasn't." Marcus's hands clenched involuntarily under the table. This was exactly the kind of illegal practice that he'd built his company specifically to avoid. Henderson's had clear policies protecting employees from this kind of abuse, and managers who violated those policies were supposed to be terminated immediately. "Have you tried talking to higher management about this?" he asked. Sarah laughed bitterly. "I tried once. I called the corporate office and left a message, but nobody ever called me back. And when my manager found out I'd called, she told me that if I wasn't happy with the job, there were plenty of other people who would be grateful to have it." Marcus felt sick. This wasn't just a single bad manager. This was systematic abuse that was happening right under his nose. How many other restaurants in his chain were operating this way? How many employees were being taken advantage of? "How long has this been going on?" he asked. "Ever since I started here about 8 months ago. Maybe longer. Some of the other servers have been dealing with it for years." Sarah suddenly looked nervous. "I really shouldn't be telling you all this. If they found out I was complaining to customers." "Your secret's safe with me," Marcus assured her. "But can I ask why you stay if things are so bad?" Sarah's expression softened, and for the first time that evening, she looked genuinely sad. "Because I need this job. I'm putting myself through nursing school, and even with the money they take from my pay, this is still the best job I can get with my schedule. I work here 4 nights a week and take classes during the day. My dream is to become a pediatric nurse, but that's still 2 years away." She stood up, suddenly, looking embarrassed. "I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm telling you all this. You just seem like someone who actually cares about other people's problems." As Sarah walked away to check on her other tables, Marcus sat in stunned silence. Here was a young woman with dreams and ambitions, working hard to build a better life for herself, and his own company was systematically stealing from her. The thought made him feel physically ill. He watched Sarah interact with an elderly couple at a nearby table, her genuine kindness shining through despite everything she'd just told him. She helped the woman choose a dessert, patiently explaining the options, and made sure the man's coffee cup never went empty. This was exactly the kind of employee that Henderson's should be celebrating and supporting, not exploiting. When Sarah returned to his table to check on his meal, Marcus had made up his mind. He couldn't reveal who he was yet. That would only complicate things, and might put Sarah in danger of retaliation. But He could start gathering information that would help him build a case against the managers who were breaking the law. "Sarah," he said quietly, "would you be willing to tell me more about what's happening here? Not right now, obviously, but maybe after your shift ends?" Sarah looked surprised. "Why? I mean, you seem nice, but I don't really know you." Marcus pulled out his wallet and placed a $50 bill on the table, far more than the cost of his meal. "Because what's happening to you and your coworkers is wrong. And maybe there's something I can do to help." Sarah stared at the money, then back at Marcus. "You're not some kind of reporter or something, are you?" "No," Marcus said truthfully. "I'm just someone who believes that hardworking people deserve to be treated fairly." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing her options. Finally, she nodded. "I get off at 10. There's a coffee shop down the street that stays open late. If you really want to know what's going on here, I can tell you everything." Marcus felt a surge of determination. "I'll be there." As Sarah cleared his table and moved on to her next customers, the coffee shop was nearly empty when Sarah walked through the door at 10:15, still wearing her Henderson's uniform with her hair now loose around her shoulders. She looked exhausted but determined as she spotted Marcus sitting in a corner booth with 2 steaming cups of coffee waiting on the table. "I wasn't sure you'd actually show up," Sarah said, sliding into the seat across from him. She wrapped her hands around the warm mug gratefully. "To be honest, I'm still not entirely sure why you want to hear about all this workplace drama." Marcus studied her face, noting the genuine confusion in her expression. "Because everyone deserves to work in a place where they're treated fairly," he said simply. "And, from what you've told me, that's not what's happening at Henderson's." Sarah took a sip of her coffee and nodded slowly. "You're right about that. I've worked in restaurants before, and I've never experienced anything like what goes on in this place. The thing is, most of the customers have no idea what's happening behind the scenes. They see smiling servers and good food, and they assume everything is fine." "Tell me more about the money they're taking from your pay," Marcus said, pulling out his phone. "Do you mind if I take notes? I want to make sure I get all the details right." Sarah looked surprised but nodded. "Sure, I guess. Where do I even start?" She ran a hand through her hair, thinking. "Okay, so there are basically 3 ways they steal from us. The first is what they call customer satisfaction charges. Anytime a customer complains about anything, their food, the service, the wait time, whatever, they automatically deduct the cost of their entire meal from our tips." Marcus typed quickly on his phone, his jaw tightening with each detail. "How often does this happen?" "At least once a week for most servers. Sometimes more if you're unlucky enough to get particularly difficult customers." Sarah's voice grew frustrated. "And here's the thing. We have no way to defend ourselves. The customer could be completely unreasonable, but management always sides with them and makes us pay." "What's the second way?" Marcus asked, though he was already dreading the answer. "Breakage and damage fees," Sarah said bitterly. "If we accidentally drop a plate or a glass, they charge us for replacement. If we spill something on a tablecloth, we have to pay for cleaning. Last month, my coworker Jessica had to pay $40 because she bumped into another server and they both dropped their trays." Marcus felt his anger building, but he kept his voice level. "That's completely illegal. Employers can't make employees pay for accidental breakage. Try telling that to the managers. They have this whole system set up. They keep a clipboard behind the register with a list of prices for everything: plates, glasses, silverware, linens. When something gets broken, they write your name down next to the item and deduct it from your next paycheck." "And the third way?" Marcus asked, though he was beginning to feel sick to his stomach. Sarah's expression darkened. "Walkouts and theft. If a customer leaves without paying, the server has to cover the entire bill. And if money goes missing from the register during our shift, all the servers on duty have to split the cost." Marcus stopped typing and looked up at her in disbelief. "They're making you pay for crimes committed by other people?" "Exactly. 2 weeks ago, a family of 6 ate a huge meal and then snuck out while I was in the kitchen getting their dessert order. Their bill was $93, and I had to pay the whole thing. That was almost half of what I made in tips that entire night." Marcus leaned back in his seat, trying to process the scope of what Sarah was describing. This wasn't just a few bad policies. This was systematic wage theft affecting dozens of employees. How many other servers know about this? Are they all experiencing the same thing? Every single one of us, Sarah confirmed. There are 12 servers who work regularly, plus a few part-timers. We've all had money taken from our pay for one reason or another. Some of the long-time employees say it's been going on for at least 3 years, maybe longer. Has anyone ever tried to fight back? File complaints with the Labor Department or anything like that? Sarah shook her head. Most people are too scared. The managers make it very clear that if you cause trouble, you'll be fired. And in this economy, people can't afford to lose their jobs, even bad ones. Plus, a lot of the servers are like me, students or single parents who need flexible schedules. Jobs like that aren't easy to find. Marcus thought about the dozens of other Henderson's locations across the country. If this was happening at one restaurant, how many others were operating the same way? How many employees were being victimized while he sat in his corporate office, completely unaware of their suffering? Can I ask you something personal? Marcus said. How much money would you estimate they've taken from your pay since you started working there? Sarah was quiet for a moment, clearly calculating. Probably close to $800 over the past 8 months. Some weeks it's just $20 or $30 for a broken plate or an unhappy customer. But then, there are weeks like last month when I got hit with multiple charges and lost almost $200 in one pay period. $800. Marcus felt the number hit him like a physical blow. For Sarah, who was working her way through nursing school, that was probably the difference between making rent and getting evicted. It was textbooks versus going without. It was the difference between pursuing her dreams and having to give up. What about the other servers? Do you know how much they've lost? Jessica has been there for 2 years, and she thinks they've taken at least $1,500 from her. Maria has been there even longer, and she's probably lost more than that. The worst part is that some of the older servers have just accepted it as normal. They think this is just how restaurants operate. Marcus felt a surge of determination. These weren't just numbers in a corporate report. These were real people with real lives being systematically robbed by managers who thought they could get away with it. Sarah, he said carefully, if there was a way to stop this and get back the money that's been stolen from you and your co-workers, would you be willing to take some risks? Sarah looked at him suspiciously. What kind of risks? And why do you care so much about this? Most people would just say that sucks and move on with their lives. Marcus had been dreading this moment, but he knew he couldn't continue the conversation without being at least partially honest. Because I have some experience with employment law, and what you're describing is seriously illegal. The kind of illegal that could result in criminal charges for the managers involved. Are you a lawyer? Sarah asked, her eyes widening. No, but I work in business, and I know enough to recognize wage theft when I see it. Marcus leaned forward. Sarah, if you and your co-workers were willing to document what's happening and provide evidence, it might be possible to not only stop this, but also recover all the money that's been stolen from you. Sarah stared at him for a long moment. You're talking about going up against Henderson's corporate. Do you have any idea how powerful that company is? They have teams of lawyers and unlimited resources. What could one customer possibly do against a corporation like that? Marcus chose his words carefully. You'd be surprised what one person can accomplish when they're fighting for what's right. But you wouldn't be doing it alone. If we can gather enough evidence and get other employees to come forward, there are government agencies that investigate this kind of thing. The Department of Labor takes wage theft very seriously. And, in the meantime, we all get fired and blacklisted from every restaurant in town, Sarah said skeptically. There are laws protecting employees who report illegal activities by their employers, Marcus explained. Retaliation is also illegal, and companies that engage in it face serious penalties. Sarah was quiet for several minutes, absently stirring her coffee while she thought. Marcus could practically see the internal struggle playing out across her face, the desire for justice warring with the very real fear of losing the job she needed to survive. What would we need to do? She finally asked. Marcus felt a surge of hope. First, we need documentation. Pay stubs showing the deductions, records of what you were charged for, and when, any written policies or memos from management about these practices. Do you have access to any of that? I have all my pay stubs at home, and I've been keeping track of the charges in a notebook because I couldn't believe how much they were taking. Sarah pulled out her phone and showed him a notes app. I've got dates, amounts, and reasons for every deduction over the past 4 months. Marcus stared at the screen in amazement. Without even realizing it, Sarah had been building a legal case against Henderson's. Her meticulous record-keeping could be exactly what they needed to prove the systematic nature of the wage theft. This is incredible, Sarah. This kind of documentation is exactly what investigators look for. Marcus scrolled through her notes, each entry representing another crime committed by his company. Would any of the other servers be willing to share their records too? I think so. We talk about this stuff all the time. We're all frustrated and angry about it. The problem is that most people are just focused on getting through each shift and making enough money to pay their bills. They don't think there's anything they can do to change the situation. What if I told you that there might be a way to change it without anyone losing their jobs? Marcus asked. What if we could make this right while protecting everyone involved? Sarah looked at him with a mixture of hope and skepticism. I'd say that sounds too good to be true, but I'd also say that I'm willing to listen. Marcus knew he was walking a fine line. He couldn't reveal his true identity yet. That would complicate everything and potentially put Sarah and the other employees at risk. But he could start laying the groundwork for the investigation that would ultimately expose the corruption at this location and potentially others. Here's what I'm thinking, Marcus said. Give me a few days to make some phone calls and do some research. I want to find out exactly what options we have and what kind of protection exists for employees who come forward. In the meantime, keep documenting everything that happens. And maybe start quietly talking to your coworkers about whether they'd be willing to share their experiences if it could lead to getting their stolen wages back. Sarah nodded slowly. I can do that. But I have to ask again, why are you doing this? You don't even know me. And you're talking about taking on a major corporation on behalf of a bunch of restaurant workers you've never met. Marcus met her eyes directly. Because everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, especially people who work as hard as you do. And because sometimes the right person comes along at exactly the right moment to make a difference. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Sarah turned to Marcus. Marcus spent the next 3 days conducting his own investigation, and what he discovered made him sick to his stomach. Using his executive access to Henderson's internal systems, he quietly reviewed payroll records, employee complaints, and manager reports from locations across the country. What he found was a pattern of wage theft that extended far beyond the single restaurant where he'd met Sarah. Sitting in his home office at 6 in the morning, Marcus stared at his computer screen in disbelief. 17 different Henderson's locations showed suspicious payroll deductions. Hundreds of employees had filed complaints about unfair charges that had apparently been ignored by regional management. Most disturbing of all, he found evidence that some district managers had actually encouraged these practices as a way to boost store profitability. His phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. Can we meet tonight? I talked to my coworkers, and you're not going to believe what I found out. Marcus immediately called her back. What happened? Are you okay? I'm fine, but this is so much worse than I thought, Sarah said, her voice tight with emotion. It's not just our restaurant, Marcus. Some of the other servers have friends who work at different Henderson's locations, and they're all dealing with the same thing. Marcus felt his heart sink, even though he'd already suspected as much. How many other locations are we talking about? At least 4 that I know of for sure, maybe more. And there's something else. One of the servers here has been secretly recording conversations with the managers about these policies. She's been collecting evidence for months because she was thinking about quitting and wanted to have proof of what was happening. Marcus sat up straighter. She has recordings? Audio recordings of the managers explaining how the deduction system works, including them admitting that they know it's probably illegal, but that corporate doesn't care as long as the numbers look good. Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. Marcus, these people are talking about this stuff like it's just normal business practice. We need to meet tonight, Marcus said immediately. Can you bring the other server with the recordings? Her name is Diana, and she's already agreed to meet with you. She's been working at Henderson's for 3 years, and she estimates they've stolen over $2,000 from her alone. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. $2,000 from one employee at one location. If similar theft was happening at 17 locations with an average of 12 servers each, The company could be looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen wages. Same place as last time? He asked. Actually, Diana suggested we meet at her apartment. She lives alone and feels safer talking there. Plus, she has all her documentation organized at home. Marcus hesitated. Meeting at a private residence felt like a bigger step, but he understood their caution. Text me the address. I'll be there at 10. The rest of the day passed in a blur as Marcus struggled to focus on his regular CO duties while his mind raced with plans for the evening's meeting. He found himself looking at his executive team differently, wondering which of them knew about the wage theft and had chosen to ignore it. The thought that people he trusted might be complicit in this systematic abuse made him feel physically ill. Diana's apartment was in a modest complex about 10 minutes from the restaurant. When Marcus knocked on the door, it was opened by a woman in her late 20s with short black hair and tired eyes that spoke of too many double shifts and too much stress. "You must be Marcus," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I'm Diana. Sarah's told me a lot about you." Sarah was already there, sitting at a small kitchen table covered with papers, pay stubs, and notebooks. "Diana's been documenting everything for months," she explained as Marcus took a seat. "Show him what you found." Diana sat down across from Marcus and opened a thick folder. "I started keeping records when I realized that the amount of money being taken from my pay didn't match what the managers were telling us about company policy. Look at this." She handed him a spreadsheet that she'd clearly spent hours creating. It detailed every deduction from her pay over the past 18 months, complete with dates, amounts, reasons given, and her own notes about each incident. Marcus studied the document, his anger growing with each entry. Customer satisfaction charge, $47.83. Customer said soup was cold. Breakage fee, $23. Dropped water glass during busy dinner rush. Walkout coverage, $76.45. Family left without paying while server was helping elderly customer. "This is incredibly detailed," Marcus said, looking up at Diana. "You've essentially created a legal case file." "I'm a business major," Diana explained. "I know how to organize information, and I had a feeling that someday I might need this evidence. I just never thought anyone would actually want to see it." Sarah leaned forward. "Show him the recordings." Diana pulled out her phone and connected it to a small Bluetooth speaker. "I started recording conversations about 3 months ago when my manager explained the customer satisfaction policy to a new server. I wanted to have proof that these policies were coming from management, not just rumors from other employees." She pressed play, and suddenly, the room filled with the voice of a man Marcus didn't recognize. "Look, I know it seems harsh, but this is how we keep our food costs down and our customer satisfaction scores up. When customers complain, we make them happy by comping their meal. And then, we make sure our servers understand that providing excellent service is their responsibility. If they can't keep customers satisfied, they need to cover the cost of that failure." Marcus felt his jaw clench as he listened to the manager's casual explanation of what amounted to theft from his employees. But what came next made him even angrier. A female voice, presumably a new server, asked, "But what if the customer is being unreasonable? What if they're just trying to get free food?" The manager laughed. "That's not your concern. Your concern is making sure every customer leaves happy, no matter what it takes. If you can't do that, maybe you're not cut out for this job. We've got plenty of other people who'd love to work here." Diana paused the recording. "That's our general manager, Rick Morrison. He's the one who implements all these policies." And the woman asking questions was a server named Amy who quit 2 weeks later because she couldn't afford to keep working here. Marcus had heard enough. "Diana, how many of these recordings do you have?" "About a dozen conversations over the past 3 months. Some are with Rick, some are with the assistant managers. I've also got recordings of them training new employees on the deduction system." Diana's expression hardened. "They're very careful to never put any of this in writing, but they have no problem talking about it openly." Sarah spread out several more documents on the table. "I talked to servers at 4 other locations like I mentioned. They're all dealing with exactly the same policies, sometimes word for word. It's like there's a manual somewhere that teaches managers how to steal from employees." Marcus knew there wasn't an official manual, but he was beginning to suspect that some district managers had developed these practices on their own and spread them to multiple locations as a way to improve their performance metrics. The thought that his own management structure was being used to systematically rob his employees made him feel like he was going to be sick. What about the other servers at your location? Marcus asked. Would they be willing to come forward if it meant stopping this and getting their money back? Diana and Sarah exchanged glances. We've been talking to them all week, Sarah said. Most people are scared, but they're also really angry. If there was a real chance of getting justice without losing their jobs, I think at least 8 or 9 servers would be willing to participate. What would that look like? Diana asked. Coming forward, I mean. What exactly would we have to do? Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to say would change everything. Before I answer that, I need to tell you both something. I haven't been completely honest with you about who I am. Both women looked at him with sudden wariness. What do you mean? Sarah asked. I told you I work in business and have experience with employment law, Marcus said carefully. That's true, but it's not the whole truth. I'm in a position where I might be able to help you more directly than I initially let on. Diana leaned back in her chair. Are you a lawyer? A government investigator? What? Marcus looked at both women, knowing that what he was about to reveal would either make them trust him completely or make them run screaming from the room. I'm the CEO of Henderson's Restaurant Group. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stared at him like he'd just told her he was from another planet. Diana's mouth fell open, and she reached unconsciously for her phone as if she was going to delete the recordings. You're kidding, Sarah finally whispered. Please tell me you're kidding. I'm not kidding, Marcus said gently. My name is Marcus Williams, and I built Henderson's from the ground up. What's happening to you and your co-workers is happening in my restaurants, to my employees, and I had no idea until I met you 3 days ago. Diana found her voice. Oh my God, we're so fired. Sarah, we just played recordings about stealing to the actual owner of the company. We're not just fired, we're probably going to jail. No, Marcus said firmly. You're not fired, and you're certainly not going to jail. You're the victims here, not the criminals. The people who are going to jail are the managers who have been stealing from you. Sarah shook her head slowly. I can't believe this. The CEO of Henderson's was eating dinner at our restaurant, and I complained to him about his own company. This is insane. Sarah, look at me, Marcus said, waiting until she met his eyes. Everything you told me about what's happening at that restaurant is true, right? You weren't exaggerating or making anything up. Of course not. Why would I lie about that? Then, you have nothing to worry about. What you did was help me discover that people in my company were breaking the law and hurting my employees. You helped me find out about a problem that I would never have known about otherwise. Diana was still staring at him in shock. So when you asked us about documentation and evidence, I was trying to figure out how extensive this problem is and what we'd need to stop it, Marcus explained. I've spent the past 3 days investigating, and what I've found is that this isn't just happening at your location. There are at least 17 Henderson's restaurants where similar wage theft is occurring. 17. Sarah's voice was barely audible. Maybe more. And now, thanks to the information you've both provided, I know exactly how they're doing it, and I have evidence that can be used to prosecute the people responsible. Marcus leaned forward. Here's what's going to happen. First, I'm going to make sure that every penny that's been stolen from you and your coworkers gets returned with interest. Second, the managers responsible for this are going to be fired and criminally prosecuted. And third, I'm going to implement new systems to make sure this never happens again at any Henderson's location. Diana looked skeptical. And what happens to us? Even if you don't fire us, do you really think we can keep working there after this? The other managers will make our lives miserable. The other managers are going to be too worried about their own jobs to bother you, Marcus said. Because I'm not just cleaning house at your location. I'm cleaning house everywhere this is happening. Anyone who was involved in or knew about these illegal practices is going to be removed from the company. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, clearly trying to process everything. Why should we trust you? She finally asked. I mean, you own the company where all this is happening. How do we know you won't just cover it up to protect Henderson's reputation? Marcus understood her skepticism completely. Because covering it up would be the worst possible thing I could do, both morally and business-wise. This kind of systematic wage theft is a federal crime. If it comes to light that I knew about it and didn't act, I could face criminal charges myself. But, more importantly, I built this company to be better than this. Everything I've worked for is meaningless if my restaurants are places where hard-working people like you get robbed by their own managers. He pulled out his business card and placed it on the table. Here's my direct phone number. Call me tomorrow, and I'll walk you through exactly what we're going to do to fix this. But, for tonight, I want you both to go home and think about whether you trust me enough to see this through. As Marcus prepared to leave, Diana spoke up. Mr. Williams? Marcus arrived at Henderson's corporate headquarters at 5 in the morning, 3 hours before his usual start time. He needed privacy for what he was about to do, and he didn't want any of his executive team around while he conducted his investigation. Using his master access codes, he began pulling personnel files, payroll records, and communication logs from every location where he suspected wage theft was occurring. By 7 o'clock, he had identified a network of corruption that went far deeper than he'd initially imagined. District Manager Paul Rodriguez had apparently been teaching illegal wage deduction practices to store managers across his entire region for over 2 years. Internal emails showed him praising managers like Rick Morrison for their creative approaches to cost management, and encouraging others to adopt similar strategies. Even worse, Marcus discovered that Rodriguez had been receiving bonuses based on the improved profit margins at his locations, profit margins that had been artificially inflated through wage theft. The man had literally been getting rich by systematically robbing Henderson's employees. Marcus's hands shook with rage as he read through Rodriguez's communications. In one email, the district manager had written, "Remember, these people are easily replaceable. If they don't like our policies, there are plenty of others who would be grateful for the opportunity to work for Henderson's. Don't let them intimidate you with threats about labor laws. They don't have the resources to fight us." That email alone was enough to end Rodriguez's career and potentially send him to prison. At 8:30, Marcus's assistant knocked on his door. "Mr. Williams? You're here early today. Is everything all right?" "Cancel all my meetings for the rest of the week," Marcus said without looking up from his computer. "And I need you to get our legal department head, our HR director, and our head of security in here immediately. Tell them it's a crisis situation and they need to drop everything they're doing." Within an hour, Marcus had assembled his core team in the conference room. Attorney Janet Chun, HR Director Michael Torres, and Security Chief David Park sat around the table looking concerned as Marcus spread out printed copies of the evidence he'd collected. "What I'm about to show you," Marcus began, "represents the biggest crisis our company has ever faced. We have systematic wage theft occurring at multiple locations, with the knowledge and encouragement of at least one district manager and possibly others." Janet Chen's face went pale as Marcus walked them through the evidence. The illegal deduction policies, the audio recordings Diana had made, the email communications between Rodriguez and his store managers, it all painted a picture of criminal activity that had been happening under their noses for years. "Jesus Christ," Michael Torres whispered as he listened to one of Diana's recordings. "These managers are literally training new employees on how the theft system works. They're treating it like standard company policy." David Park was studying Paul Rodriguez's personnel file. This guy has been with the company for 8 years. He started as a store manager and worked his way up to district level. If he's been doing this for 2 years as district manager, how many employees have been affected? Marcus had already done the math, and the numbers were staggering. Rodriguez oversees 14 locations with an average of 15 hourly employees each. If the wage theft has been happening for 2 years across all his locations, we're looking at potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen wages affecting over 200 employees. Janet Chun was frantically taking notes. "Marcus, we need to contact the Department of Labor immediately. This level of wage theft is going to trigger a federal investigation, and we want to be seen as cooperating fully from the beginning. If we try to handle this internally and it comes out later, it'll look like we were covering it up." "That's exactly what I was thinking," Marcus agreed. "But first, I want to make sure we have all the evidence we need to nail everyone who's involved. David, I need you to conduct a complete audit of Rodriguez's region. Financial records, payroll data, employee complaints, everything. And I want you to do it quietly so that nobody involved has a chance to destroy evidence." David nodded grimly. "How long do I have?" 48 hours. I want to move fast before word gets out that we're investigating. Michael Torres raised his hand. What about the employees who've been victimized? Some of them might be afraid to come forward, especially if they think they might lose their jobs for talking. Marcus thought about Sarah and Diana, about their courage in agreeing to meet with him despite their fear of retaliation. I'm going to personally reach out to key employees at the affected locations. We need them to know that they're safe and that we want to make this right. And the managers involved? Janet asked. Rodriguez and the store managers who implemented these policies. Terminated immediately once we have all the evidence compiled. And I want criminal charges filed against every single one of them. Marcus's voice was hard. These people have been stealing from their own employees for years. They need to face the full consequences of their actions. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind of activity. David Park's security team worked around the clock to audit Rodriguez's region, uncovering even more evidence of systematic wage theft. Employee interviews revealed that the illegal practices had actually been going on for closer to 3 years, and had expanded to include charges for things like uniform cleaning, training materials, and even customer service improvement courses that employees were forced to pay for out of their wages. Meanwhile, Marcus personally called every employee who had been identified as a victim of wage theft. The conversations were heartbreaking. Single mothers who had struggled to pay rent because of illegal deductions. College students who had been forced to drop classes because they couldn't afford tuition after having their wages stolen. Elderly workers living on fixed incomes who had been charged for broken dishes they hadn't even touched. Each conversation strengthened Marcus's resolve to see this through to the end, no matter what it cost his company in terms of money or reputation. On Thursday evening, Marcus called Sarah to update her on the investigation's progress. We've identified 237 employees who have been victims of wage theft, he told her. The total amount stolen is over $400,000. Sarah's sharp intake of breath was audible over the phone. $400,000? Oh my God, Marcus. That's so much money. It gets worse. We've found evidence that the illegal practices were being encouraged by district management as a way to boost profit margins. At least one district manager was receiving bonuses based on the improved financial performance of locations where employees were being robbed. So this wasn't just a few bad store managers making poor decisions, Sarah said, her voice tight with anger. This was actual policy. Unofficial policy, but yes. And, Sarah, I want you to know that we're not just going to fire the people responsible. We're filing criminal charges. The FBI's white-collar crime division has been brought in to investigate potential federal charges related to the scope of the theft. There was silence on the other end of the line for a moment. The FBI? Wage theft on this scale is a serious federal crime, especially when it involves systematic fraud across multiple locations. The people who did this to you and your coworkers are going to prison. Marcus could hear Sarah crying quietly. I'm sorry, she said. It's just, for so long, I felt like nobody cared what was happening to us. We were just expendable restaurant workers, you know? Nobody important enough to matter. You matter, Marcus said firmly. Every single employee who was victimized by this matters. And I'm going to make sure that everyone knows how important you were in exposing this crime. If you hadn't been brave enough to talk to me that night, hundreds of people would have continued being stolen from indefinitely. On Friday morning, Marcus assembled all the evidence and presented it to Special Agent Maria Santos from the FBI's white-collar crime unit. Agent Santos spent 3 hours reviewing the documents, listening to Diana's recordings, and studying the financial data David Park's team had compiled. This is one of the most well-documented cases of systematic wage theft I've ever seen, Agent Santos told Marcus. Your employees did an incredible job collecting evidence. These recordings alone are enough to secure convictions against multiple defendants. What happens next? Marcus asked. We'll coordinate with the Department of Labor to conduct a joint investigation. We'll be executing search warrants at the offices of Paul Rodriguez and several store managers by Monday morning. We'll also need to interview the employee witnesses who provided evidence. Marcus nodded. They're all willing to cooperate fully. But I want to make sure they're protected from any retaliation. They will be. Federal whistleblower protection laws are very strict about this kind of thing. Anyone who retaliates against these employees will face additional criminal charges. As Agent Santos prepared to leave, she turned back to Marcus. Mr. Williams, I have to ask, are you prepared for the publicity this is going to generate? A case this size involving a major restaurant chain is going to attract significant media attention. Monday morning arrived with a flurry of activity that would change Henderson's restaurant group forever. At exactly 7 a.m., FBI agents executed coordinated search warrants at Paul Rodriguez's home office, Rick Morrison's apartment, and 6 other locations connected to the wage theft investigation. By noon, Rodriguez and 5 store managers were in federal custody, charged with conspiracy to commit wage theft, mail fraud, and violation of federal labor laws. Marcus watched the news coverage from his office, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sadness as he saw Rodriguez being led away in handcuffs. This was a man he had promoted to district manager just 2 years earlier, trusting him to uphold the values that Henderson's was supposed to represent. Instead, Rodriguez had used his position to systematically rob the very employees he was supposed to protect and support. The phone on Marcus's desk rang constantly as reporters, employees, and competitors all tried to get information about the unfolding scandal. Marcus had prepared a statement with his legal team, but he knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to repair the damage that had been done to his company's reputation and, more importantly, to his employees' trust. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Marcus drove to the Henderson's location where he had first met Sarah. He had called ahead to let the remaining management team know he was coming, and by the time he arrived, the entire staff had gathered in the dining room for an emergency meeting. Sarah was there, of course, along with Diana and the other servers who had provided evidence for the investigation. They looked nervous but hopeful as Marcus walked to the front of the room and faced the employees who had been victimized by his company's failures. "I'm not going to stand here and make excuses," Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet room. "What happened to you was wrong, it was illegal, and it was completely unacceptable. As the owner of this company, the ultimate responsibility for your suffering lies with me." He paused, looking directly at Sarah. 3 weeks ago, I came here as a customer and learned about the wage theft that was happening in my own restaurants. Since then, we've conducted a comprehensive investigation that led to federal criminal charges against the people responsible. But arrests and prosecutions are just the beginning of making this right. Marcus pulled out a folder containing individual letters for each affected employee. Every person who had wages illegally deducted will receive full restitution plus 25% additional compensation for the hardship you endured. These letters detail exactly how much you're owed and when you can expect to receive payment. A murmur went through the crowd as employees opened their letters. Diana gasped audibly when she saw that her restitution amount was over $3,000, significantly more than even she had calculated. In addition to financial restitution, Marcus continued, "We're implementing new systems to ensure this never happens again. Every Henderson's location will now have an anonymous hotline that connects directly to our corporate compliance office. Any employee who reports illegal or unethical practices will be protected by federal whistleblower laws. And we're creating an employee rights committee with representatives from every region to monitor workplace conditions." An older server named Margaret raised her hand. "Mr. Williams, what about the managers who knew this was happening but didn't participate directly? Are they going to face any consequences?" It was a fair question, and Marcus had spent considerable time deciding how to handle the gray area employees who had witnessed the wage theft but hadn't reported it. Anyone in a supervisory position who knew about these practices and failed to report them has been removed from management and will be required to complete extensive ethics training before being considered for any leadership role in the future. However, we recognize that many people were afraid to speak up because they feared retaliation, so we're handling each case individually. Sarah stood up from her seat in the back. "Mr. Williams, can I ask you something personal?" Marcus nodded. "Of course. Why did you decide to go public with this instead of just fixing it quietly? Most companies would have tried to cover it up to protect their reputation." The room fell silent as everyone waited for his answer. Marcus had known this question would come, and he'd given it a lot of thought. "Because," he said slowly, "covering it up would have been putting the company's reputation ahead of your dignity and rights as employees. And Because I needed every person who works for Henderson's to know that if something like this ever happens again, we will take action regardless of the consequences to our bottom line or public image. He looked around the room at the faces of people who had trusted their employer and been betrayed. You deserve to work for a company that protects you, not one that preys on you. If we had to take a public relations hit to prove that commitment, then that was a price worth paying. Diana spoke up from her seat near the front. What about the other locations where this was happening? Are those employees getting the same treatment we are? Every single employee at every affected location is receiving full restitution and compensation, Marcus confirmed. We've identified 237 victims across 17 restaurants, and every one of them will be made whole. The total cost to the company will be over $800,000, but that's not counting it as a loss. We're counting it as paying a debt that should never have existed in the first place. After the formal meeting ended, Marcus stayed to speak individually with employees who had questions or concerns. The conversations were difficult, but necessary. He heard stories of employees who had worked extra shifts to make up for stolen wages, students who had dropped out of school because they couldn't afford tuition, and parents who had struggled to buy groceries for their children because of illegal payroll deductions. Each story reinforced his conviction that prosecuting the managers responsible had been the right decision, regardless of any negative publicity Henderson's might face. When most of the employees had left, Sarah approached Marcus with Diana by her side. "Mr. Williams," Sarah said, "we wanted to thank you for everything you've done. I know this couldn't have been easy for you, exposing problems in your own company like this." Marcus shook his head. "You don't need to thank me, Sarah. You're the one who made this possible by being brave enough to speak up. If you hadn't trusted me with the truth that night, hundreds of people would still be getting robbed every week." Diana pulled out her phone and showed him a news article. "Have you seen the coverage? Most of the reports are actually positive. They're calling you the CEO who chose employees over profits." Marcus glanced at the headline. "Restaurant CEO cooperates with FBI to expose wage theft at his own company." The article detailed how Henderson's had voluntarily provided evidence to federal investigators and was paying full restitution to affected employees. "The important thing isn't how the media covers this," Marcus said. "The important thing is that it never happens again, and that every Henderson's employee knows they have someone in corporate who will listen if they report problems." 3 months later, Marcus returned to the same Henderson's location for a follow-up visit. The restaurant had been completely reorganized under new management, and the atmosphere was noticeably different. Employees seemed more relaxed and confident, and the customer service was better than he'd ever seen it. Sarah was still there, now enrolled in an accelerated nursing program that she could afford thanks to her restitution payment, and a new Henderson's educational assistance program that Marcus had created in response to the scandal. "How's school going?" Marcus asked as she served his coffee. "Better than I ever imagined," Sarah replied with a genuine smile. "I'll be graduating next year, and I've already been accepted into the pediatric nursing program at the Children's Hospital. None of that would have been possible if you hadn't listened to me that night." Diana had also benefited from the changes. She had been promoted to assistant manager and was completing her business degree with help from the educational assistance program. Several other employees from the original group had received promotions or transfers to better positions within the company. The legal proceedings had concluded the previous month with Paul Rodriguez receiving a 2-year federal prison sentence and 5 store managers receiving sentences ranging from 6 months to 1 year. All had been ordered to pay restitution to their victims, and all were permanently banned from working in the restaurant industry. More importantly for Marcus, the scandal had led to positive changes throughout the Henderson's organization. The anonymous reporting hotline received regular calls, most of which involved minor issues that were quickly resolved before they could escalate. Employee satisfaction surveys showed significant improvement across all metrics, and turnover rates had dropped to the lowest levels in company history. The financial impact had been substantial. Between restitution payments, legal costs, and implementation of new compliance systems, the company had spent over $2 million addressing the wage theft scandal. However, the improved employee retention and positive publicity had actually resulted in increased revenues that more than offset the costs within 6 months. As Marcus prepared to leave the restaurant that evening, he reflected on how a simple dinner had led to such profound changes. If he had chosen a different restaurant that night, or if Sarah had been too afraid to speak up, hundreds of employees might still be victims of systematic wage theft. But Sarah had been brave enough to trust a stranger with the truth, and that courage had created a ripple effect that transformed an entire company culture. On his way out, Marcus stopped by Sarah's table one more time. "Sarah, I want you to know that what you did that night, trusting me enough to tell me what was really happening here, that took more courage than anything I've ever done as a CEO. You didn't just help your coworkers get justice. You helped me remember why I started this company in the first place." Sarah looked up from the nursing textbook she was studying during her break. "Mr. Williams, all I did was tell the truth to someone who was willing to listen. The courage was in what you did after that, choosing to do the right thing even when it was expensive and difficult." As Marcus drove home that night, he thought about the lesson he'd learned from the entire experience. Real leadership wasn't about making tough decisions in boardrooms or managing corporate strategies. Real leadership was about listening to the people who trusted you with their livelihoods and having the courage to act on what they told you, even when it was inconvenient or costly. Henderson's Restaurant Group was now a stronger company than it had ever been, built on a foundation of genuine respect for employees and authentic accountability from leadership. But, more importantly, Marcus had learned that sometimes the most important conversations happen not in corner offices or conference rooms, but at a small table in a busy restaurant, between a hard-working server and a customer who cares enough to listen. The black undercover boss had discovered something more valuable than any profit margin or performance metric. He had discovered the power of treating every employee with the dignity and respect they deserved, and the extraordinary things that could happen when someone with power chose to use it in service of justice rather than personal gain. In the end, Sarah's willingness to speak truth to power had not only changed her own life, it had changed the lives of hundreds of employees and transformed a corporate culture from the inside out. It was proof that sometimes the most unlikely encounters between the most unlikely people can become the catalyst for extraordinary change. Marcus had been dreading that question, but he'd already made his decision. "Agent Santos, my company built its reputation on treating employees fairly and providing good jobs with dignity. If we have to take a public relations hit to ensure that justice is served for our employees, then that's what we'll do." That afternoon, Marcus called an emergency meeting of his entire executive team and board of directors. He laid out the full scope of the investigation and his decision to cooperate completely with federal authorities, regardless of the potential impact on the company's reputation. "Some of you might be thinking that we should try to settle this quietly to avoid negative publicity," Marcus said, looking around the room at the faces of his senior leadership team. "But that's not who we are as a company, and it's not who I am as a person. Our employees trusted us to protect them, and we failed. The least we can do now is make sure that failure leads to justice." Board Chairman Robert Hayes spoke up. "Marcus, we support your decision completely, but we need to be prepared for the financial impact. Between the stolen wages we'll need to repay, legal costs, and potential civil lawsuits, we could be looking at millions in expenses." "Then, that's what it costs," Marcus replied. "We'll find the money. These employees were robbed while they were working to make us profitable. Paying them back isn't just the right thing to do, it's the only thing to do." As the meeting concluded, Marcus felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. For the first time since his dinner with Sarah 4 days earlier, he felt like he was doing everything in his power to make things right. But he also knew that the real test was still to come. In 3 days, federal agents would begin making arrests, and the story would become public. Henderson's Restaurant Group was about to face the biggest crisis in its history. The question wasn't whether they would survive it. Marcus was confident they would. The question was whether they would emerge from it as a stronger, more ethical company that truly lived up to the values it claimed to represent. For Sarah, Diana, and the other employees who had been brave enough to speak truth to power, Marcus was determined to make sure the answer was yes. "If you're really going to do what you say you're going to do, there's something else you should know." "What's that?" "Some of the managers have been bragging about how much money these policies are saving the company. They think corporate knows about what they're doing and approves of it because it makes their numbers look good. Marcus felt cold fury wash over him. Which managers? Rick Morrison for sure. And I heard him on the phone once talking to someone he called District about how his location had the best profit margins in the region because of his innovative cost control measures. Marcus made a mental note to pull Rick Morrison's personnel file and all of his communications with district management first thing in the morning. If district managers were aware of and encouraging these practices, the scope of this investigation was about to get much larger. As he drove home that night, Marcus realized that his simple dinner at one of his restaurants had uncovered the biggest crisis his company had ever faced. But it had also given him the opportunity to do something that most CEOs never get the chance to do: directly help the employees who had been wronged by his company and make sure that justice was served. The easy thing would be to quietly fix the problem and hope nobody ever found out about it. But Marcus knew that wouldn't be enough. He owed it to Sarah, Diana, and hundreds of other employees to not just fix the problem, but to make sure everyone responsible faced the consequences of their actions. The real work was just beginning. One more time. I don't even know your last name. Williams, Marcus said truthfully. Marcus Williams. Well, Marcus Williams, I hope you know what you're getting yourself into, Sarah said with a slight smile. Because if we're really going to do this, there's no turning back. Marcus watched her walk to her car, knowing that she had no idea just how right she was. There would definitely be no turning back. Not for her, not for him, and not for the managers who thought they could steal from their employees without consequences. As he drove home that night, Marcus was already planning his next moves. But first, he needed to find out just how widespread this problem was across his company. If one location was operating this way, there was a good chance others were too. The investigation was about to begin, and Marcus had a feeling that what they discovered would shock everyone involved. Seated, his mind racing with plans. He thought about all the corporate policies he'd put in place to prevent exactly this kind of abuse. He thought about the managers who were clearly ignoring those policies, and the employees who were suffering because of it. Most of all, he thought about Sarah, a young woman who was working her way through school, dreaming of a career helping children, and being systematically robbed by the very company that should have been supporting her ambitions. By the time Marcus left the restaurant that night, he had already decided that this wasn't just about one location or one bad manager. This was about the soul of his company, and he was going to do whatever it took to make things right. The rain had stopped by the time he reached the coffee shop, but the storm that was about to hit Henderson's restaurant chain was just beginning.